to thank Ulama for organizing this, and thank Melanie, Jillian, and Larissa for actually taking the time to read the chapters. And the comments are really helpful. It's really different to hear, like, to begin with, hearing through review praising what's important about the book, right? Because we've been so close to it for a long time. Lama and I began this discussion, so I'm just going to spend a minute just going over a bit of how this came about. So we had our first panel on discussing what's going on in Lebanon at Mesa in November 2019. And it was very weird to come back from the street, go to Mesa, and break all the conventions regarding should I be wearing a suit or not? Should I be doing this or not? And we ended up actually having more discussions, which always happens at Mesa, in the around the bar than actually within the panel room.
And so over po' boys as well. Exactly. And over po' boys in Jeff. Sandwiches.
I would say just one fast thing, and before I can dive into other comments, because I hope to collect more reflections from everyone. I think one underlying feature of the book that we experienced in the street that we have not fleshed out really has to do with the ceiling of our imagination at the beginning of the uprising, which actually was defeated, if we're going to use the language of success and failure. The government, the regime, the pillars of the system, if you're thinking about banks, if you're thinking about the Lebanese armed forces, if you're thinking about political parties, part of this neoliberal tradition is to provide spaces of contestation, right? To provide us with wiggle room that we own the streets, we own the classrooms, but in reality, from the very first day, our moments of mobilization were still limited. And when I say by limited, when Ria mentioned the idea about the parliament was blocked up from the first day. So it was a big no-no in where we can actually organize and what we can mobilize. And then the counter-revolution began on the same evening, but it really got deep 3 weeks in. But within these 3 weeks, the government was actually smuggling what remained of US dollars and reserves in the banks. So it was really a great space for us to vent off, attack different stores, do what we would characterize as the euphoric moment of this outburst of hope in the earlier weeks of this revolutionary situation. But it was always clear to us, to a certain extent, and I say this with the vantage point of hindsight, that this order creates this illusion that we have multiple voices in the street. At least there's some understanding that it's no longer the I, it's really about the we. But when it comes down to it, these are from the very initial meetings that we were holding with different groups and what to think about the alternative. No one really wanted to talk about the alternative. So we only want to talk about how this is leaderless and how the civil war, quote unquote, has ended, how people are going for the first time to Tripoli and experiencing something new. All these stereotypes are not, no one's going to kidnap them there, or they're going to see Salafis everywhere in town. All these stereotypes were part of this revolutionary magic, right? But it also, if we fall into that trope of thinking of what did that achieve or not, this is where we can go back to Killian's point regarding, well, the success to a certain extent was being able to think about how intersectional these issues are, but without saying it on paper, but actually through the lived experience. And the lived experience of it, having people get out of their bodies in terms of thinking about LGBTQI rights, for instance, was something new. And when I say something new, it's for partisans to be in the street and be able to see women chanting, right, leading the demonstrations was not something that many were accustomed to. So maybe that's a small outlier that we did not highlight, but it's one of the things that I think Rima and I, Roland and others that were in the street felt was revolutionary on its own. So it was a win for us to be able to experience that on a daily basis, rather than just thinking about, well, the regime is going to be, are we going to be able to revamp it? Are we going to be able to reform it? So much of the processes argument that we had in mind, and in the book, we are constrained by how much we're going to go into this personal reflection and still be able to make a clear theoretical contribution, was really trying to think about wins and failures and successes, not as a sort of experience that we saw in the first 2 days. Because if you want to talk about failure, one could think about the evening of October 17. That was the first evening when people started to be repressed and started to be arrested and were tear gassed. And there are videos and pictures that show that this moment could have been defeated from the very first hour, but it pushed through. Why did it push through? This is in part how, like, for instance, Mona Harif's chapter about spaces and urban activism touch on these types of contestation. Or Sanata Nouri's Karam's chapter on the theater of Lebanon, basically, in different phases of how it became a space, as Lama was saying, for people to organize around, how it was a space that people were denied access to during the Civil War, and how we reclaimed that space. But it's also important to keep in mind that much of the discourse about reclaiming, recapturing, also gives the sense of the I, that we were able, and much of the campaigns, which is like Ana Khat Ahmar, for instance, some of the campaigns really showed how much there's a vested interest in what can this group achieve from this moment, while many in the street were trying to think about, well, are we going to be able to have a broader discourse, right? And what that broader discourse was is something still to be debated. But again, when we are thinking about this moment, whether it begins or ends, and if you want to compare it to, we had one autocrat to deal with, in many ways, I think it's not only the 6 or the 7 that Rima mentioned, but also what comes with the 6 or 7. And sometimes the counter-revolution began with people within our own circles, right? Convincing them that it's not about elections or having, like many of our friends, Rima and I talk about this a lot, had full lists for cabinets, right? They had full lists of who's going to be Minister of Environment, Minister of I don't know what, and they were happy to go to the regime and say, you're giving us the space because the president at some point in time invited the revolution, quote unquote, the revolutionaries to come to the palace and discuss. And apparently within days, some of our friends had lists of people that should run for office. And we wanted to reconcile that with the bigger idea of, well, what does this mean in practical terms, right? Are we reforming the system? Are we keeping it as is? So we can go more and more about that, but I just want to highlight the idea of writing about this, like really inviting scholars and activists and thinking about this from the perspective of writing it during crisis with all the reasons in the world why this could be a failed experiment, right? It's very easy to be able to think about COVID-19, think about the August 4 explosion, think about the economic recession right now, and also think about how the government creates these crises and comes in to solve them, and the kind of social normalcy that people are trying to relive right now. And if we think about that, that is a sense of defeat that really makes this book a bit dated, if we think about it from that perspective, right? But we're also trying to send out a message of hope that we can't think about 1917 in Russia without thinking about the failure in 1905 to a certain extent. And I can go on and on with examples from now to the end of time. But in the case of Lebanon, what's exceptional about this moment is really being able to create thoughts, not only for the sake of the book, as Zira mentioned, but also beginning the discussion of we are experiencing a moment where there are lots of, like, I would say pain, but also hope. When we were chanting in the street from Beirut to Baghdad or to all other places around the world, which really shows that to a certain extent, maybe we're not going to call it the neoliberal failure of neoliberalism or the failure of modernization or the failure of development or the failure of these promises that are going to create opportunities for all. But generally speaking, in the street, this was felt and people called it different names. So when people said Thawra on the first evening, many of the press outlets were, oh, protest, some people are on the street, they're hijacking the banks, but we committed to the idea, and Rima and I put that introduction on purpose to be able to say that maybe it's not a Thawra because it doesn't have all the aspects of what an actual revolution should be, but it's also one that we're not going to deny the agency that people have when they want to label what they're experiencing and what they're feeling in the street. And to many of them, this was an actual revolutionary moment. And in a way, this is something we're hoping to highlight. So the comments from everyone, and Jillian, thank you a lot for the specific ones on my chapter. And again, this is a problem where the chapter is 11,000 words. And the idea of affect is so close to my heart because I think a lot about discourse and emotions when it comes to really understanding.
I'm super sorry, Jeff. I hate to cut you off, but I want to make sure, just because we